It's a long way to Tipperary, it's a long way to go. It's a long way to Tipperary, to the sweetest girl I know. Goodbye, Piccadilly, farewell, Leicester Square. It's a long, long way to Tipperary, but my heart's right there. It's a long way to Tipperary, it's a long way to go. It's a long way.
It's a particular pleasure to welcome John Sneddon to the rostrum. John was one of the first cohort of MA students in British First World War Studies at Birmingham under our dear friend John Bourne, and I had the pleasure of touring battlefields with John as well. A memorable trip in many ways, a bottle-filled tour it turned out to be. But John typifies, I think, the spirit of that first group at Birmingham, many of whom are in the room, and one of them particularly vocal in the questions. John's had a distinguished academic and research career, both in biological chemistry. Have I got that right? That'll do. And also on retirement, he's contributing to our scholarship in various ways. It's particularly pleasing to have a chairman of a Western Front branch giving a paper. So, John Sneddon.
Thank you very much. Get myself organised. First slide says a history of the Trench Warfare Department. That's a lie. Because I'm not going to give you a history. I'm going to give you an introduction. And I'm going to limit myself mainly to 1915. And also, for the sake of simplicity, I'm going to refer to the object of my fascination throughout as the Trench Warfare Department, but it had a number of other names during the time it was in existence. So we start. I want to start in the War Office. I want to start in the Directorate of Fortifications and Works. Trench Warfare Department had a fairly unorthodox birth in this department, and in particular in section FW3, which was to do with coastal defences, forts and gun emplacements and that kind of thing. And on the declaration of war, the officer in charge of FW3 wangled himself a position as a Royal Engineer, the BEF, and went. And he was replaced by another Royal Engineer, a Colonel Louis Jackson. Right, this is he. This is Colonel, later Brigadier General Sir Louis Jackson. And I'll put my head on the line. If I have a historical ambition left in my life, it's to rehabilitate this man and move him into his proper status in the historiography of the Great War. Jackson was an authority on field fortifications and siege warfare. He was the chief instructor at Chatham before he retired from the army in 1913. He was recalled to service in 1914, and I've said he was made head of section FW3, and as the fates would have it, Jackson was the right person in the right place at the right time. When trench warfare became established along the Aisne in September, the Royal Engineer Field Companies started requesting from the War Office items of equipment such as trenching machines, which were used in agriculture, water pumps, mining equipment that were not Army issue. And it fell to Jackson, in his position in the War Office, to find civilian suppliers to provide this kit for the field companies. And this had a number of consequences. As you would expect, civilian kit isn't suitable for military use. So Jackson fairly soon started experimenting with this kit to try and make it suitable for military use, and to do this, he created an experimental ground on Clapham Common. This kind of work brought him to the attention of GHQ in France, and they put in their first order to do with trench warfare, and that was they asked Jackson to develop movable shields behind which small groups of infantry could gather, and they could push this shield on wheels across no man's land as they attacked the enemy positions. Not a mad idea. The French and German army devoted a lot more time than we did to developing that kind of shield. The third thing I put up here sounds a little bit geeky, and that was he was authorized to make purchases not on the approved list. What do I mean by that? Obviously, the War Office manufactured a certain amount of kit for the army, but a lot of kit it bought in, and it bought from a list of companies that were approved suppliers. There was about 1,000 of companies on this, and they provided the army with anything from trouser buttons to heavy artillery. And it was utterly forbidden for the War Office to buy off this list. The Treasury wouldn't meet the bills. However, because Jackson was providing this obscure equipment to the field companies, the Master General of the Ordnance, Major General von Donop, gave Jackson permission to buy off the list. And that freedom of action in purchasing was going to be something that Jackson was going to exploit to the full as he developed the Trench Warfare Department. The second sort of step in our journey occurred in November 1914. Two things happened. One was that the Indian Corps developed a small munitions factory behind their lines in France. This munitions factory was producing extemporized grenades and extemporized mortars, and the idea caught on. And other field companies also started producing these small munition factories or creating them. They were called bomb factories in the literature. And we find by the end of November 1914, Jackson was supplying so much high explosive to these bomb factories that he started to encroach on the supplies for artillery ammunition. This raised the ire of the Directorate of Artillery, who threatened to cut off his supplies of conventional high explosives like TNT. This forced Jackson to start looking at the civilian market to find an alternative explosive. He tested dozens of them before he decided that a suitable explosive was a civilian mining explosive called ammonol. And he found that this was suitable filling for grenades, for mortar bombs, and for the general sort of engineering work that Royal Engineers did. The significance of Jackson introducing ammonol as a military explosive cannot be underestimated. Okay, so ammonol is an explosive based on ammonium nitrate. And I think that his introduction of ammonol represents his greatest contribution to the war effort. And why do I say that? It's because nitrate explosives, unlike military explosives, are cheap to make. Military explosives were expensive. They used chemicals which were now in short supply because before the war we imported the damn things from Germany. And ammonol and its related explosives. I'm going to use ammonol as a general term, but there were all sorts of different mixtures containing ammonium nitrate and other explosives. But for convenience, I'm just going to mention ammonol. Right? These explosives became the most important military explosives in both world wars. They were used for grenade fillings, for mortar bombs, aerial bombs, mines, and general military explosive work. And as far as World War I is concerned, without the introduction of nitrate explosives, it would not have been possible for us to produce the millions of shells and the millions of mortar bombs and grenades that were required to defeat the German army. We just did not have a chemical industry capable of, for example, producing that amount of TNT. And then in December 1914, two other events occurred that were going to make a great difference. The first one was that General Foch who was the chief engineer to the BEF, wrote to Jackson and asked for stink bombs. He wanted these stink bombs for clearing dugouts and German trenches. And this got Jackson involved in the development of the chemical warfare program for the British Army. And I'll come on and talk about that, or mention it later on. Second thing that happened towards the end of the year was a demand for grenades. Or more precisely, it was a real upsurge. In 1914, the BEF had access to 2 grenades. It had this one, which is the service grenade number 1, which was made by the Royal Ordnance Factory in Woolwich, and this one, its cousin, which is the Hales grenade, which was patented by Martin Hales and manufactured by his company, the Cotton Powder Company. To us these days, these grenades look pretty crude, and to a certain extent they were, but they are precision pieces of kit. They required the skills of skilled machinists to make them. Both of them, as a safety measure, they're both percussion grenades. Both of them had a special detonator that was very slow and very expensive to make. Therefore, there was no way that either the Royal Ordnance Factories or the Cotton Powder Company were going to meet the demand for grenades. You just could not step up the production to the levels required. If we move on, right? So if we just look at the right-hand column, this is the demand from GHQ for grenades. December, 6,000 a week, right? Went up to 15,000 in January, went up to 42,000 in June, and after they had digested the impact of the early battles in 1915 and realized the importance of grenades in that kind of fighting, the orders from GHQ were coming in at 700,000 a week. So you can see the kind of sort of demands. The Germans were ahead of us in grenade fighting, and as the Hales and the number 1 couldn't keep up with the demand, the army started manufacturing its own. We have the next slide, please. I have a partner here. And these are the jam tin grenades. Basic model, there's a ration tin, a small amount of explosive contained in a little bag, surrounded by bits of metal or stones. Shove a detonator into the bag, about 5 seconds worth of Bickford fuse, seal it, and when you want to use it, you light the fuse with a cigarette or a pipe and just throw it at the enemy. The variation on it was this, the so-called hairbrush grenade, and this consists of a paddle and a throwing handle, contains a box containing explosives attached to a detonator and fuse. And this was used very much like the German potato masher grenade. Now, it's one of the myths of the Great War that these grenades were manufactured by the infantry in their spare moments when they were sitting in their trenches. Nothing could be further from the truth. All of these weapons were produced in these munitions factories that were set up by the Royal Engineer Field Companies. So you'll find along the line, along the British line, these little factories. And the factories employed French civilian labour, both men and women, and were the major source of grenades in particular, but also mortar bombs for the British Army up until the late summer of 1915. And the production rate of some of these was really quite fantastic. The Indians, for example, were turning out nearly 10,000 grenades a week in their little factory. Just in case I give you the impression that only we resorted to these homemade weapons, the hairbrush there is French. And if I could have my next slide. These are German jam-tin grenades. And the next slide is a German soldier in his trench pulling the fuse on a German hairbrush. So all armies on the Western Front in late 1914 and really up until the end of the summer in 1915 relied heavily on these improvised weapons. Now, as you might expect, the quality of these grenades wasn't all that great. There were accidents where the people using them were either killed or wounded. But the main problem with them was that they were unreliable. The worst thing that happened, you couldn't control the fuse, or they didn't control it, and you had premature explosions. In other words, a grenade got off, blew up before it reached its target. And it was straightening out these deficiencies that changed FW3, Jackson's department, and let it evolve into the Trench Warfare Department. One day in the War Office, Major Jackson heard the Master General of the Ordnance having a bitch about these grenades being made in France, how ineffective they were and the potential dangers of using them. And Jackson said to von Donop, "If you give me permission, sir, I will make you a better grenade." The importance of that statement is that Jackson is a Royal Engineers officer, and Royal Engineer officers did not handle munitions. They may provide explosives, but they didn't handle munitions. And the fact that von Donop gave Jackson permission to manufacture and develop a weapon, i.e. a hand grenade, removed Jackson's munition-making activities away from the control of the Directorate of Artillery and the Ordnance Board. This meant that everything that Jackson and his colleagues produced could be fast-tracked through the process in the War Office. It missed a whole line of bureaucracy. Right, so Jackson's first grenade was this. This is the number 8. So that's what it looked like on the outside, and that's what it looked like in the inside. The inspiration for Jackson's grenade, we have to go back to the introduction of ammonol. Ammonol was an explosive made by the Rubberite Company, and one of their products was an extruded tin tube about 1 inch in diameter, which was filled with ammonol and slipped into the drill holes either in a quarry face or a coal mine prior to blasting. Jackson must have been familiar with this bit of kit because he asked the company if they could scale it up to extrude two tubes, one about 4 inches in diameter and one about 3 inches in diameter that fitted inside one another. The inner tube, or the inner container, was filled with explosive, had a detonator, 5 seconds of Bickford fuse, and an igniter. The space between the inner and outer cylinder was filled with shrapnel balls embedded in resin. Now, some people dismiss these kind of grenades as sort of, Mickey Mouse bits. This grenade was a very, very efficient grenade for its time. Thousands, tens of thousands of them were made and were shipped to France. So they were very effective in their time. Jackson also made a heavier grenade called it's number 9, which was to be used with trench catapults. And in the course of 1915, the Trench Warfare Department, as it was going to come, developed about 15 grenades. Not all of them saw service, but they developed all sorts of grenades for different purposes, including smoke grenades, phosphorus grenades, and chemical grenades. And all of these sort of temporary grenades were phased out towards the end of 1915 when the Mills grenade was introduced. Jackson was not responsible for the development of the Mills grenade. That was being done in the War Office by the Directorate of Artillery through the normal sort of slow processes that continued in the War Office even into the war. I said this is going to be a quick flick through. May I go just want to talk a bit about bomb throwers, because they again were very important in 1915, although we don't hear a lot about them. When Jackson was given permission to develop grenades by von Donop, he also asked for permission to develop trench mortars. Von Donop, Master General of the Ordnance, said, "Sorry, lad, because mortars discharge their shell with an explosive charge, they're the responsibility of the artillery and not an engineer officer like you." So Jackson was excluded from developing trench mortars in early 1915. This presented him with a problem, because he already had been asked by GHQ France to develop a means of throwing a hand grenade further than a man could throw it. And the obvious solution was a mortar. But that was now closed off to him, so he looked at ways of doing it mechanically. His first experiments were with compressed air guns. So it's something that looked like a mortar tube, put a grenade in it, and had a compressed air cylinder attached to piping and blew it out. He was quite unhappy with the results. One, it didn't go very far. On the other, he realized that the heavy cylinders and piping associated with a compressed air gun is not quite the thing you want to be dragging around in a frontline trench. Then one day in October 1918, a Mr. Claude Pemberton Leach made an appointment to see Colonel Jackson because he wanted to demonstrate a catapult he invented. So they took him out to Clapham Common to the test ground, and Mr. Leach demonstrated his catapult, and much to Jackson's surprise, it could throw a golf ball over 200 yards with amazing accuracy. And Jackson asked Mr. Leach if he could scale up his catapult so it could throw a 2-pound hand grenade roughly the same distance, of which Mr. Leach could do it. This is the Leach catapult in action. It's leaning against the parapet, as you can see. There's the end of the parapet, and these are the lads here. This gives you a better idea how it works. Okay, it's a Y frame with elasticated ropes at each arm of the Y, ending in a cup here, which holds the grenade. The ropes are pulled back by means of this pulley and held in place by a trigger mechanism. And to fire it, you release the trigger, and it's very much like, I'm of the age, and some of us obviously around here are the same, when we had catapults at school. Exactly the same mechanism. Now, many of us who should know better think that this is a bit of Heath Robinson bit of kit. It was anything but. Both the French and German armies extensively used bomb throwers. They used bomb throwers in 1915 and 1916, and they didn't entirely disappear from the battlefield until late 1917. Bomb throwers were actually used at Third Ypres, both by us and by the Germans, even though we had all these fancy mortars by then. So coming back to the Leach, the Trench Warfare Department manufactured over 3,500 of these, and they were sent to equip, obviously, the Western Front, but also over 200 were sent to Gallipoli. And although they were replaced by the Stokes mortar in early 1916, the units that had them continued to use them right up until the end of 1917. And those infantry units, and the Australians liked them a great deal that used them, they were used mainly for tossing smoke grenades in support of local attacks. It had 200 yards is a good distance to be able to pitch a smoke grenade if you're going on a trench raid. So that's what they were sort of used for. Leach catapult had a lot of advantages over the mortars that replaced it. One, it was substantially more accurate, it was silent, and it didn't make a noise or have sparks or anything else that would allow the German observers to work out where it was situated along the British line. The disadvantages of the Leach was that it was slow to fire, a slow rate of fire. The ropes, these elasticated ropes, deteriorated rapidly under conditions of trench warfare, as you can imagine, and it was not possible to scale it up without losing range. So that was the main reason they went. The second bomb thrower developed by the Trench Warfare Department was this one, which is the West Spring gun. Much more complicated and difficult to use. The power on this one comes from this bank of springs here, which was compressed by this long cocking lever and then held in place by a trigger mechanism, and the cocking lever also elevated the arm, and the bomb was put in the pouch here. West Spring gun has never been my favourite trench weapon. It's got so many deficiencies to it that I'm absolutely amazed that over 300 of them were manufactured, and many of them were used in frontline trenches. So one of the major disadvantages of the weapon is its size. Another problem with it is that when the cocking arm comes up, when it's firing, that's a trench parapet, it has to go above the parapet to throw the bomb. So that was immediately observable by the Germans, and they could work out where the thrower was situated. The other problem we had is when the arm got to the vertical, there was a nasty tendency for the grenade to fall out of the pouch among the crew. And if you read through the records, you'll see many courts of inquiries into deaths of crews through this accident happening. The last one, which always gives me the shivers, is that the trigger that released the springs was in an awkward position. And if you didn't pull your hand away fast enough, you lost fingers, as happened to Captain West, who invented this gun during one of the times he was demonstrating it. So as I said, it's not my favourite trench warfare weapon. So we now get to the spring of 1915. Jackson is still in the War Office. He's now been moved sideways in a way, in that he's so much involved in developing these weapons and producing them that the War Office create a special section for him in typical War Office manner. It's FW3A. And if we have a look at Jackson's responsibilities in the War Office, he was responsible for every weapon that the trench war, or to do with trench warfare, that the War Office produced, except for mortars, which remained with the Directorate of Artillery. So he was responsible for non-lethal chemical munitions, such as tear gases, body armour and modern shields. It was the Trench Warfare Department that developed, not invented, but developed the Brodie helmet, for example. He was involved in making these extemporized grenades, the bomb engines. He spent a lot of time at the beginning of 1915 with his staff supporting Tom Tulloch's ideas for an armoured fighting vehicle based on caterpillar tracks. And he was maintaining close contact with these Royal Engineer bomb factories in France that were making grenades and mortar bombs. So that was the situation in late spring 1915. The really radical change occurs in June. May I have the... And the most important was the transfer into the new Ministry of Munitions. It's difficult to explain very briefly the consequences of this. When Jackson was absorbed into the Ministry of Munitions, he had a staff of 12. He had 3 Royal Engineer officers, some clerks, secretaries and support staff from the War Office. So that was in June 15. In November 1915, he had a staff of over 400. And this was not only just an increase in personnel, but it was an increase in a whole range of responsibilities that were absorbed into the Trench Warfare Department. Could I have... So if we're looking, say, 2 months into it, so we're looking at the late summer of 1915, Jackson's FW3, which was now called the Trench Warfare Department within the Ministry of Munitions, was responsible for the research, development and manufacture of all grenades, including the mills, which had taken over from the War Office, all trench mortars, including the Stokes, all chemical munitions, both lethal and non-lethal, all the Livens projector, which came on stream in 1916, It was the trench warfare department that Livens came back to in order to develop the giant projector that you've seen a TV program about, as well as the Livens drums, the flamethrowers, protective equipment, the gas mask, tin helmets, body armor for sentries, all that kind of stuff, and signaling equipment such as flares. They also worked on sniper scopes, periscopes, spent a lot of time developing fuses for mortar bombs and grenades. And from 1917, which is outside I'm going to talk about, they developed mine sinkers for the Navy. They developed the aerial bombs that were used by the Royal Flying Corps, and they, much later than the French, they developed chemical shell for the artillery. In addition to all of this, they were continually doing bits and bobs and things, modifying existing equipment with the aim of making the soldier in his trench much more militarily effective and sometimes even a little bit safer, like tin helmets. I'm going to quickly run through one. Could I have the next one, please? I'm going to talk about how they made the munitions, because this is one of the unique features of the Trench Warfare Department. First thing to say is the Trench Warfare Department did not invent all the weapons it produced. Instead, it had a knack, its research group under Jackson in particular, had a knack of taking other people's prototypes, like Stoke and his mortars, Mills and his bomb, and Captain Levin and his projectors, and turning them into robust battlefield weapons. And the way they organized the manufacturing was absolutely unique. When General von Donop first gave Jackson permission to make a grenade, he imposed restrictions on him. And the restrictions were, okay, Jackson, you can make the grenade, but you must not use any factory space currently required for the war effort. Immediately eliminated all the munition companies and their subsidiaries. You must not use any raw materials that are in short supply or essential to the war effort. And you must not use any labor, skilled or unskilled, that's essential to the war effort. Right? The result of this was that the Trench Warfare Department, or TW3 as it was then, had to start developing relationships with hundreds of small companies and workshops that were not already involved in making anything for the war effort. And by definition, such companies did not have the best equipment and generally had a semi-skilled labor force. As a result, if you look at trench warfare weapons, they're fairly crudely made and the engineering tolerances are quite large because of the way in which they were constructed. To give you an example how it all worked, I want to have a quick run through how the Mills bomb was made. Now, William Mills, using government funding, built a factory in Birmingham here to manufacture his Mills bombs. However, by the middle of 1916, the BEF was wanting a delivery of 1.5 million Mills a week. So there was no way that one factory was going to meet that demand. So what the Trench Warfare Department did was organize over 200 small companies to manufacture the Mills grenade. First thing was that the grenade bodies were cast by any company that had a furnace that could melt iron. So the kind of companies that they were contracting for to make the bodies were these: machinery manufacturers, motor engineers, people who made domestic stuff like file fenders, gas meters, etc. So any company that could melt iron got a contract to manufacture the bodies for the Mills grenades. I hope the finer work was also carried out by dozens of small companies. So dental instrument makers, toy makers, makers of locks and nuts and bolts, and all these kind of companies were all given contracts to make the fiddly little bits that go in to making the Mills grenades, the springs, the levers, and all the rest of it. And also, because of 1 million grenades, 1.5 million grenades, bit difficult filling them all with explosives, so they formed a consortium of the small firework companies around Halifax, who had gone out of business or had no business because of a wartime ban on firework displays, and they organised them as the filling factories for the mills. So just let's have a look at the consequences of what I've just shown you, if I may have. Right, so what the Trench Warfare Department had to do was provide all these small foundries with the raw materials, because all raw materials were controlled by the Ministry of Munitions. You couldn't just go and get scrap iron from the yard round the corner. And they had to collect these rough cast bodies that were made by these companies. These bodies had to be machined, the holes had to be drilled in them for the fittings, etc., which required another set of engineering companies. Then you had the fitments, the springs, the levers, the fuse holders, etc., all had to be made and had to be fitted together. You had to transport all these components to the filling stations, i.e. around Halifax, where they were assembled into the grenade, and it was filled with explosive. Every stage, from the casting onwards, had to be quality assured and checked it was up to specification. And then the final assembled grenades had to be inspected, boxed up, and then sent to the munition officers on the lines of communication. To pull all this together, Jackson organised a group called the Outside Engineering Branch. These are mainly civilian engineers, and if I can just have a look at some of their roles. These supply officers had total responsibility for the manufacture, quality assurance, and delivery of their particular munition. So, for example, if there was a dozen or so small companies in Solihull, there'd be one supply officer who was responsible for those companies and the grenade production. If they were also producing Stokes mortar bombs, there would be another supply officer responsible for their production of the Stokes bomb. So in any given area, the munition was the responsibility of a single supply officer. These officers issued specifications, the drawings, negotiated the contracts, trained the workforce in these companies if necessary, and provided all the raw materials. Can you have the next one, please? They had a staff that worked under them, where they arranged regular inspection, excuse me, sometimes even daily, to check the quality of the work, introduce any modifications, make sure there were no hold-ups and things like that. And it was the responsibility of the supply officers to see that all the components were up to standard and could be assembled into the completed grenade. And once they'd inspected everything and approved it, they then released the grenade into the lines of communication to go to the BEF in France. An exactly similar setup would exist for the the Stokes bombs and the other things that were made by the Trench Warfare Department. So it was like a huge cottage industry dispersed throughout the country, not the big munition factories that we're all familiar with from making shells under the Ministry of Munition contracts. And the next slide, I don't want you to pay a lot of attention to, because it's the kind of slide you should never put up, but it's just to show you, this is from one area. This is area number 2, which is Manchester, and shows production over, it says a year here, but in fact, in reality, it's the first 6 months of 1916. And you can see the kind of things they had. 2-inch howitzer bombs, that's the toffee apples. 500,000 of those. Emergency ball grenades, 4.5 million. Where are we? Mills grenades, 4 million. And we get down here to reducing valves, which were required for gas warfare. They made 8 of those. So you get some idea of the diversity of things produced by the Trench Warfare Department and also the numbers that were produced by the Trench Warfare Department. The Trench Warfare Department was responsible for the introduction of mortars. Now, I don't mean that they invented them, and the BEF had them before the Trench Warfare Department started. But if you, could I just have the next slide, please? Right, this is the Krupp mortar, the toffee apple mortar. It was developed by Krupp engineers and was under Krupp patents. And the BEF wanted this mortar. It's a handy thing, it's not too big, and it can fire a very big bomb. It can toss 50 pounds of high explosive nearly 800 yards. So it's a very useful weapon. However, the Royal Ordnance Factories only made 25 of them and then stopped. So we're now looking at the beginning of 1915. And the reason they stopped is because they produced this bomb using munitions grenade steel and used the same fuse and detonator that was used in an 18-pound shrapnel shell. Both munitions grenades, the steel and the fuses were in short supply. Therefore, priority was given to artillery shells, and there wasn't much left over to produce mortar bombs. So the Royal Ordnance Factory was actually producing about 200 of these a week when GHQ France was asking for a delivery of 5,000. When the responsibility for mortars was transferred to Jackson and his unit, after they'd gone into the Ministry of Munitions, he sent one of his people out to Woolwich to see what was going on. And the fellow, the Lieutenant Sutton, immediately realized this bomb sticks outside the tube, so it's not subject to the stresses of an artillery shell, and he quickly demonstrated that the bomb worked equally well if it was made of cast iron. This then meant that it could be made by any company that had a furnace, opening up the possibility of mass production. As far as the fuse was concerned, it took the Trench Warfare Department less than 4 weeks to come up with an effective fuse that was both cheaper and easier to make than the one used in 18-pounder shrapnel shells. So with that and some modifications to the gun carriage, what was a highly specialized weapon requiring hard-to-get materials was transformed within weeks to a weapon that worked equally as well, but used cheap materials and could be made by any number of companies. And it was those kind of changes that the Trench Warfare Department introduced into manufacturing of some of these weapons that ensured that, for example, the 2-inch medium mortar, which is this, was available in hundreds with thousands of rounds of ammunition for the Somme battle. I mean, this mortar with a graze fuse was a major weapon that the BF used in 1916 for wire cutting. So it was so important that they had a lot of them. I am not going to talk about the Stokes, so we can run over the next one, please, mainly because it's a much more complicated story than I've got time to go in here. And if we just briefly have a quick flick at Jackson's interests in chemical warfare. It comes as a surprise to most people when I tell them that Britain was the only industrial nation that had a chemical warfare program before the war. I don't know how it came about, but I suspect it was to deal with Boer riflemen hiding behind boulders that were too widely dispersed to deal with shrapnel. Whatever the reason, from 1913 until 1912, the Royal Experimental Laboratory at Woolwich carried out a series of experiments on chemical fill for artillery shells. The government put an end to it in late 1912 because the Foreign Office ruled that if it wasn't exactly illegal, this kind of munition was against the spirit of the Hague Convention. The War Office wouldn't accept that and took their own legal advice and restarted the chemical warfare program in 1913, but concentrating on non-lethal chemicals, because they thought that was one way of getting around the restrictions of the Hague Convention. So when General forecast for his stink bombs, the War Office already had a bit of a chemical warfare program running, and Jackson plugged into this, working with the chemists at Imperial College in South Kensington. And the chemicals that were synthesized by the chemists were tested in a courtyard at South Kensington, where Jackson had constructed a length of trench, And the way of testing was pretty crude. The chemical was in a glass vial, it was smashed against the wall of the trench, and how long Jackson or one of the chemists could stay there was a measure of potency. So that was the way in which they were working out the chemical warfare. They quickly identified ethyl iodoacetate as a very powerful tear gas, and they gave it the code name SK for South Kensington, where Imperial College is, and SK was to remain the standard British Army tear gas throughout the war. Just another sort of little story of the kind of things that were going on, and then I'll just finish. When they were demonstrating the potency of SK to the Ordnance Board, it almost failed. And it almost failed because one particular officer was tall and his head protruded above the trench, and he said, "This damn thing has no effect." So what Jackson did was he went out into the street and got a boy who was passing and offered him a shilling if he would walk down through the trench. As Jackson literally says in his report to the War Office, the effect on the boy and his subsequent language convinced everybody of the potency of SK. Jackson prepared a report for GHQ France on using tear gas grenades and sent that report to them in February 1915. It was rejected by Sir John French because it was ruled that using chemical weapons was contrary to the usage of war, and they weren't interested. So that's 2 months before the German gas attack. After the German gas attack in April 1915, GHQ obviously changed its mind and started screaming at the War Office for both defensive and offensive gas warfare. In other words, defend the troops and give us something to hit the Germans with. And in the beginning of May, Lord Kitchener called Jackson into his office and appointed Jackson as the person who was going to be responsible for the development of the British chemical warfare program. And Jackson, in fact, headed up that until he left the Ministry of Munitions in late 1917. So Jackson was also responsible there. And just to round off, Jackson was the person that was responsible for the creation of the special brigades. After the German gas attack, he sent a memo to the War Office suggesting that they form special units of Royal Engineers made up of men with chemical knowledge, and that a gas depot was developed in France for the British gas effort. Jackson picked the first group of officers and men for the special brigades, and GHQ appointed Colonel Fuchs as the director of the new unit. It was also Jackson who made the decision to use chlorine at Loos. Jackson argued that the Germans must have tried every gas, known and unknown, before they came to the conclusion that chlorine was the cheapest and most effective thing available in bulk. So he was the one who chose it. So you can see from this very brief run-through of something that I'm quite fascinated by, why I want to rehabilitate Colonel Jackson. And I shall leave you, if I may, with, if we go right to the end, please, there we are, with the gentleman who had the up and go to develop trench warfare. Thank you.
It's a long way to Tipperary. It's a long way to go. It's a long way to Tipperary, to the sweetest girl I know. Goodbye, Piccadilly. Farewell, Leicester Square. It's a long, long way to Tipperary, but my heart's right there. It's a long way to Tipperary. It's a long way to go. It's a long way to Tipperary, to the sweetest girl I know. Goodbye, Piccadilly.